Hi, Max. Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you too. Glad to be here.
I follow your YouTube channel for ages now. I really appreciate you coming here and doing this art dialogue. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name is Max Miller. I have a YouTube channel that I started back in 2020 called Tasting History. Every week I make a recipe from history, whether it be ancient Rome or Mesopotamia, medieval Europe, going all the way up through World War II and even a little bit beyond that. Then I talk about the history of whatever food it is that I'm making. And I do try to use actual period recipes. So the version is as close as I can get in my home kitchen to what they were eating back then.
How did you came up with this idea?
One big inspiration for me was actually the Great British Bake Off. Great show, and I love it now, but I really loved the first few seasons when Mary Berry was still on it, and they would have a little history section in pretty much every episode. And they would talk about the history of the Battenberg cake or whatever it was they were making, a 2 minute segment, very, very short. And then they stopped doing that, and I really missed that. So I kind of started doing that myself when I would bring my baked goods into work. I used to work at Walt Disney Studios and coworkers baked goods and tell them the history. And one day, I had been thinking of starting a YouTube channel just as something to do that was creative for myself. And one of my coworkers said, "This is the YouTube channel. These little stories that you keep telling us about the history of food. Put that on YouTube." And I was like, "Okay, that's what it is."
What moment or dish made you fall in love with food history? Was there a spark or did it simmer slowly over time? I'm very proud of that pun, simmer slowly.
It definitely simmered slowly over time. I've always been into history. Food is kind of always on the periphery because everybody eats throughout history. That is one thing we have in common with everybody who's ever lived. But I can remember one thing. It wasn't actually a food. It was a cookbook that did really spark a lot of interest in me, and that was the form of curry. They mentioned it in an episode of The Great British Bake Off, but then I went online and started researching it and found a wonderful documentary about the form of curry. This is one of the oldest cookbooks from medieval England. It was written around the year 1390 by the cooks of King Richard II. And it's just a wonderful compendium of what rich people were eating at that time. And it's so, you can, it's this interesting piece because you can see a lot of similarities in modern foods. Like you can see things that haven't changed that much, but then you can also see things that were wildly different because often we think of, especially British food, it has a terrible reputation for this, but just a lot of Northern European food has a lack of Eastern spices. They don't use a lot of Eastern spices, but in medieval Europe, at least if you were wealthy, they used a lot of Eastern spices, things that were coming from India and China and the Spice Islands because that was a wonderful way to show off your wealth. And so you see these dishes for like sweet and sour fish, and just thinking that that's what they were eating in medieval England. I found that very, very fascinating.
You mentioned Disney. I didn't know that you worked in Disney.
Hmm.
How would this theatrical storytelling influence your storytelling?
My whole life is about and always has been about storytelling. Ever since I was a little kid, I would put on plays in my, from my family and their friends. And then I did musical theater professionally for a decade or more, and then moved into voiceover. And finally, I started working for Disney, kind of behind the scenes in the marketing world. But even then, with marketing, it's all about storytelling. And that is what Tasting History is about. I don't think of it as at all as a cooking channel. I
Yeah.
do cook on it, but that's not the point of the channel. The point of the channel is to tell stories from history and connect these dots and kind of make a person realize what they have in common or what they don't have in common with people from the past. So I think that storytelling is all around us, and it is the best way to impart information. For me, my love of history came via storytelling. It wasn't by reading history books. I do love reading history books now, but I got into history because my grandfather was alive during the Depression and was in World War II. And when I was a kid, he would tell me these stories about going to England and Germany during the war and surviving the Dust Bowl. And he had a wonderful way of telling these stories so that even as a little kid, 6, 7 years old, I was just enthralled and engaged and could put myself in his shoes. And that was what got me into history because that's all that history is stories, sometimes with a bit of fiction in sewn in, very often actually, and sometimes it becomes hard to discern what is real and what's not. But yeah, storytelling is, I think it's one of the most important skills as well, especially going into kind of this new post AI world. I think that storytelling and having that skill is something that will remain very important.
You grow up in a home where food had stories, right?
It was typically family stories. I grew up in Phoenix, and so we ate a lot of Mexican food. My family is not Mexican, but my family has lived in Arizona for several generations. There are personal stories that my family would have linked to this food. And, every Christmas we would have certain foods that my grandmother ate during the Depression, and one of my family's favorite dishes is something we call taiko chicken, which is a Japanese fried chicken similar to katsu, but it's a little bit different. And what makes it very different for us is that nobody else knows this dish by that name because my mother and father learned to make it when they went to Japan in the 70s from a woman that they met named Taiko. So it's just named after her. So nobody else knows this dish by that name, but for us, that's the story that is attached to it. But obviously, every family has those stories. Then every culture, every country, every period in history has those stories. So it's a mine, unfathomably deep mine of food history.
I'm always interested in processes. If you could meet yourself when you started it, what would you say to yourself?
When I started tasting history, I had, in a way, kind of already answered a lot of the questions that needed to be answered because while tasting history is, it took off, I had done many, 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 many other creative endeavors that did not take off, at least not to the degree that this did. And so really it's the me of those previous years that I would rather talk to, and be able to tell them what I learned by doing tasting history and why did tasting history take off when all these other things that I had tried never did. And the number one thing is, and the thing is, you can't really tell somebody this; they won't believe it until they actually do it. But um, make what you want to see or write what you want to read. I try to make a video that I think that people want to see, and then it never does well. And then I make something that I want to watch or want to learn about, and that does well because I am my audience. When you are doing something creative, it is so tempting to try to make something that other people want to watch because
Yeah.
you want them to watch it because you want them to enjoy your art. When I used to do theater, when I would audition, my thought was always like, well, what do they want to see? What do they want me to do in this audition, rather than going in and saying, this is me, take it, leave it, whatever. And it wasn't until I started doing that that I started actually booking roles. With almost every other endeavor that I had tried, the goal was to be successful and to, have it take off. With tasting history, the goal was less that because I had a job that I loved. So it wasn't, my goal was not to make a living from this, was not to make this my, the only thing that I do. I had a job that I loved. This was simply a creative outlet. And so I could do and put up whatever I wanted. And so I made exactly what I wanted to see and didn't care what the audience thought about it. The only thing that I really have learned is how to do that better, how to actually make what I want to see. And it is a continued learning process. I still will watch a video, even 3 months old, and be like, oh, that's terrible. I could do better now. So it's an ongoing process.
For me, it's always technical stuff. Seriously, I
That's
changed
that's one of the
five.
biggest things for me too.
Yeah, I changed five different microphones, and they give me the different tone of voice.
A lot of people always ask me, well, what do you use to edit your videos? Because I do pretty much everything on my own. I do have some people who help out on different aspects, but I still do most of my editing and everything, and I do it all on iMovie. And people are like, "Well, that's just so basic. Why don't you use, Final Cut or Premiere or whatever?" And I'm like, I don't need to learn that. I don't want to learn that. The
Mm.
more the more complicated I ever try to get when it comes to the technical stuff, to the sound, to the lighting, to the editing, I just screw it up. And it's like just another thing to learn. So I'm all about just keeping it as simple and basic. That's why, except for a few tiny things, nothing has changed in the production since I started the channel, or at least since just a few episodes in. The only thing that's gotten better is I have learned how to use my camera better. I have learned how to use my sound and audio and everything better.
Are you an actor?
Yes, that's what I trained in.
Yeah, because your pronunciations are perfect. And me with
Thank
my
you.
accent, it's always like, oh, I need to cut this word and cut this word to make one word that actually makes sense. Do you ever worry that historical food would be niche, or did you always know it could be universal?
I am constantly, to this day, baffled by how popular and how well received it is. No, it's very niche. I thought it was just going to be a very small group of nerds like me. And there is that group of nerds like me. Absolutely. But then there are also people completely not into history, not into food, who watch my videos. And I love that because it is universal, but it doesn't seem like it would be. I mean, it just seems like such a niche thing. I, yeah, I'm constantly baffled by its success, quite honestly.
But how long does it typically take from discovering a recipe to filming to editing and then uploading it?
The whole process, and it does vary greatly, but it can take anywhere from, I would say on average, it's 35 to 45 hours of work for each video. Part of it depends on how well I know the history that I'm going to be talking about, or if I've read about it somewhere before and I'm like, oh, I know there's a lot of information in this book about that. And then sometimes it is, I know that there's got to be something interesting about this, but I have no idea where to look. And I need a lot of it translated because it's in a language that I don't know and that I can't even use Google Translate to, sometimes it's an ancient language or whatever. So sometimes it can be very, very difficult to find that history. When it comes to the recipe, I would say that it's the easiest part actually, because as long as I find something interesting to talk about history wise, I can usually find a recipe to accompany that. The further back in time I go, the more difficult it does become because there are less recipes written. But the food is the easier part for me. It's the history that really can be like pulling teeth. But I think for me, at least, the history part is actually the part that I'm most interested in. So even though the research is the most difficult part of the process, it's also the part that I enjoy the most. I would be doing that whether I was making the show or not.
What is the strangest or most unexpected place or history or recipe that you found?
I don't know. I'm always there are a lot of them that surprise me, that are they're usually when it's not a recipe per se, but more of just kind of a mention of something, whether it be in a poem or a song, or right now I'm working on a dish about what the Stoics, Zeno the Stoic, specifically the founder of Stoicism, would have eaten. And there's a story about him eating lentil soup, and he talks about there need to be 12 pieces of coriander added to it. It's not a recipe at all. Things like that, I'm always fascinated by, and kind of surprised that I'm able to put something together based on very little information. There are also dishes that I have come across that surprise me in how much I like it. I just actually made, so I'm not a fan of jelly and gelatin, that texture. So things like aspic and the great molded jellies of Victorian England, they do not tempt me. But I just made one that's a champagne jelly with fruit in it. And I ended up absolutely loving it. You got to try things. Even if you don't think you'll like it, you got to try things. Haggis is another one. Oh, I made haggis in
Oh,
Scotland a few years ago, and just the concept of it just makes me, the smell of it when it was boiling was very unpleasant. And then you eat it, and it's very good. There's nothing not to like about it as long as you like meat. Try everything. And sometimes that does not always happen. So very often it's like, I don't think that this is going to be something I like, and then I try it and I was correct. Jellyfish has never grown on me. I do not like it. Most mushrooms, honestly, the texture I don't love.
some of the recipes you make are from civilizations long gone, right? Do you
Yes.
feel sense of responsibility when you resurrect them?
I don't know if responsibility is the right word, at least no more than anything else. Every dish that I make, every history that I talk about, whether it is from a group of people who are long gone or are still around, I do my best to recreate it as authentically as possible in my kitchen using modern equipment. I don't do any, it's not about recreating it necessarily in the style that they would have done at the time. But it is about trying to be as authentic as I can, and when I can't be, talking about that and talking about, what we know, what we don't know. The further back in time, the less we know. Some of this stuff is a lot of guessing, usually by people who are far more educated on a specific subject than I am. When doing Mesopotamian beer, I rely on the work of archaeologists and people who all they do is focus on the specific topic of Mesopotamian beer. You can't be an expert in everything. It goes for the same for a modern culture that is simply different than mine. There are cuisines out there that I am not used to, but that when I make something from that culture, I try to be as authentic as possible and, treat it with just as much respect as I would a grilled cheese sandwich, which I would treat with utmost respect because I love them. So it's more about trying to, I don't want to say be impartial when storytelling and everything, because I don't think you can be, and that's not necessarily my desire. But it's more of trying to tell their story through their words as well as I can.
Did you ever make a dish, historical dish, that you found disgusting to taste, to eat? Everything about it was wrong, but you did it anyway just to show how it is.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. The one that comes to mind is the ancient Roman patina of jellyfish, egg frittata with jellyfish in it. I'm not a huge fan of eggs, and I'm really not a huge fan of jellyfish. It was horrible. And that's always funny, when I'm writing a cookbook. For me, how good the food is has almost no importance to me. It is only about how good the story is, how interesting it is to talk about this food. That's the only thing that I'm thinking about when I'm writing an episode. How delicious something is doesn't matter.
Yeah. Do you ever cheat
Right.
by adding some flavors or recipes
No.
that are? Do you think that act of resurrecting the dish, a dish, is kind of art? Is it science? Is it something spiritual for you? Is it something that you admire?
For me, And this is one thing that I love about food history. It is one of the only ways that I am able to immediately connect with people from the past and not have to just use my imagination. When you're reading about the life of Julius Caesar, everything is in your imagination. Yes, you can feel, oh, yes, I felt what he's talking about, but it's all in your head. There's nothing tangible to it. I cannot put myself really in his shoes when reading his works or what other people wrote about him. It's all imagination, which I love. But when you eat something that they would have eaten, even if the ingredients have changed because they have, it's not going to be exactly the same, but you're getting maybe 85% of the way there when you're recreating one of these recipes. It is an immediate visceral reaction. You are eating what Julius Caesar ate. And so you can put yourself in their shoes. I think historic clothing is another way to do this. I have a lot of respect for people who recreate clothing from the past. And so you can literally walk in someone else's shoes and get that immediate, this is what it felt like to ride a horse wearing a full suit of armor. Because often when we imagine it, it is very different than what actually people who have done this, what actually the experience is like. And so I think food and clothing are two of those arts, because they are, I think, arts that can really put you right there and make you connect with the past.
Thank you. That was a really good answer. But is every dish a time capsule? And what century or year or culture has surprised you the most in terms of flavor, in terms of what they ate?
I often come back to medieval and Renaissance Europe. I'm always surprised by those flavors. They are, I don't want to say they're very different from what we eat today, but they are very different from the European cuisine that we eat today. I feel like a lot of dishes from medieval Europe for the wealthy, and those are the recipes that we have. A lot of those dishes have more in common with Middle Eastern or Indian cuisine today than they do with many modern European dishes. When you recreate a dish like Scapi, who was cooking for the Pope, I mean, the wealthiest of the wealthy, he actually wrote down the amount of spice to use in all of his dishes, and they are outrageous, the amount of that he was using. These recipes come from before the standardization of our palate, which took place about 100 years later in the 17th and then early 18th century. The concept of sweet is for dessert and savory is for the main meal. That was a concept that was put together by the French mostly in the 17th and 18th century. They kind of codified that. Before that, you'll find a lot of dishes that are the entree, the main dish, and it has a ton of sugar in it and cinnamon. And it's like, well, this should be, ready for pumpkin pie, but it's actually the soup, the main soup, or the chicken dish. Finding all of these flavors that they use rose water a lot and saffron, things that you find in Middle Eastern cuisine today. It was, in a way, it was a lot more international than we would typically think of European cuisine being.
Food, I think, is often invisible in discussion of art. Do you think it's been unfairly to exclude food from canon of artistic expression?
That totally makes sense. I mean, it definitely is art, but I think that it is a harder art to capture because by its nature, it is impermanent. Most art is permanent. The Mona Lisa hasn't changed in 500 years. I often always think of this when it comes to music. There are two aspects of music that are artistic that are completely separated from each other. There is the music, the written notes, and then there is the performance. And very often these are two completely different artists that are, doing this. Sometimes they're the same, but they're two different aspects of the art. And one is fairly permanent and one is gone the moment it exists. until we have recordings. And now we can actually hear what an artist, a performer created, but we will never truly know what a Mozart sonata sounded like during Mozart's time. All we have is a written music. There are all of these artists from history, performing artists who we can never actually appreciate. And that's the same with food. Yes, we have the recipe written down, but the actual dish is an art that is gone very often minutes after it's created. And so it's just harder to study that as an art rather than somebody like Michelangelo, whose art is permanent. From the consumer's side, it's harder to study food as an art, at least throughout history. We can really only study current food in our time as an art in a way.
Do you ever think that the way of culture that eats specific food reveals its soul?
Yes and no. I don't think it has to.
Mm.
I think a lot of food is utilitarian, but there are definitely certain foods that either very purposefully reveal something about a culture's values or beliefs, because a lot of times food is linked to religious ceremony. And when people eat foods in remembrance of people, those foods can tell a lot about what a society appreciates. One aspect of food that really, really shows what a culture believed is the Egyptian culture. When Howard Carter went to King Tut's tomb and opened it up for the first time in thousands of years, there was gold, there was art, and there was food, and there was King Tut, of course. But there were mounds of mummified foods that were left for him to take into the afterlife. You were able to learn from that what was important to these people because they believed that this was what the person was going to be taking into the afterlife. And so, of all the things, food was one of those main things. And what foods were important? What foods did a king get? So, you can see the importance of certain foods on and learn a lot about what was important to people back then. Um, but I think that any food can show certain aspects of a culture, and sometimes it's hard to discern what those were because, especially through history, looking back, we're always putting our own morals, beliefs, philosophies onto people in the past. No matter how much you try to distance yourself, you can't not put your own beliefs onto other people. It's purely impossible because that's just how our brains work. I feel like when we try to attribute a thought to a person in the past and basing it off of something like a piece of art or food or something like that, there's always this aspect of, well, maybe, but maybe you're putting a lot of your own beliefs in there as well, and you can't really tell what that person was thinking. I took a lot of literature classes. My mother taught literature. There's always this aspect of learning literature where author meant this. When they wrote these words, the author actually meant this. This is symbolism and everything. And with some authors, that is absolutely true. But I also think with some authors that the literature professor is putting a lot of their own beliefs and what they want it to mean. It happens to me. I'll write a script and I'll do a video and there'll be a line in it that everybody attributes something to. They were like, "Oh, that was sometimes it's a joke that I didn't read, that I didn't write as a joke, but it happens to be a pun that I just didn't, come across." Or but very often it's something a little more like people will put a malicious intent or that I'm trying to say something in their subtext. It's like, no, there's no subtext. I was just reading a line that I didn't really put enough thought into clearly when
Yeah,
I wrote it. And
yeah.
we often put these wonderful writers on a pedestal and think that they are perfect and they thought out every single line. And I know many, many writers who are wonderful writers, and that is not always the case. Sometimes they're just writing because they think it's interesting or whatever. It makes the story move along. It
Yeah.
we place a lot of importance where sometimes importance doesn't need
Yes.
to be there.
Do you think that American culture has its own historical cuisine, or is it still forming?
I think every culture is still forming their cuisine. I think it is one of those arts that's always changing. I do think that there is an American cuisine, absolutely. I just think that the internationality of America means that a lot of our cuisine is taken from other places, but that's just how cuisine always has been. A lot of people say the hamburger, well, that's German, and pizza, New York style pizza, well, that's Italian. In the same way that Italian pizza is actually Greek, then yes, but it's every culture changes the food to meet their own needs and their own desires. So an American hamburger is absolutely nothing like the Hamburg steak of Germany. And Italian pizza, most Italian pizzas are very, very different than most American pizzas. In fact, what many Italians hate to learn is that many of the styles of pizza that are popular in Italy today actually are based on the American style of pizza. There were several Italian styles of pizza that were brought over and were made in America by Italian immigrants. They changed because that's how cuisine happens. It changed over the decades. And then when Americans began visiting Italy in the 1950s after World War II, they were disappointed with the pizza that the Italians were making. And so many Italians started adopting certain aspects of American pizza to make it more palatable to American tourists. Now it's this kind of interesting hybrid of these two different types of pizza that came together. And that happens with food all the time. Absolutely all the time. It's not an American phenomenon, it's not American tourists. It is just how food works throughout history.
Yeah, like ideas, they travel, they don't know borders. What you said, does that make food sort of a cultural patterns that they have that they're changing over time?
Yes. Sometimes I think it's just hard to pinpoint what causes these changes. I think it's
Mm.
it's very interesting when we do know what causes one of these changes, but I think 99.9% of them, we have no record of why someone started putting something on a certain dish and then that's what became popular.
So we spoke about art. What is art to you?
Oh gosh. Art to me is an effort to get thoughts and feelings that are inside of me to be felt and thought by someone else in the same way that I am feeling and thinking them.
Mm.
And I think it's almost impossible, but I think, you know, a good artist gets pretty darn close.
How would you like to be remembered?
Oh boy, I don't know. Um, I think it's as generous. I think that that's the one thing that I want to kind of leave people with is that I was a generous person with my time, with my knowledge, and hopefully someday with my money. But
You were generous with your time with me, so thank you. If you could have a dinner, coffee, a beer with any historical or fictional figure, who would it be?
oh man, so many. I think Mozart. He's one of my favorite composers, and I feel based on his letters and what's been written about him, I think that he would just be a fun person to hang out with. Quite the sense of humor and just so smart. And I would actually like to cook him something that he would have never eaten before, but that would still have a bit of familiarity to him. And so it would actually be that taiko chicken that my dad makes, that Japanese style chicken, because it is not all too different from something like a schnitzel that Mozart would have eaten, but it has these new flavors from Japan, which surely Mozart never tried.
Yeah,
So I think it would be a nice conversation piece as he composes me something on the spot.
I know that you have to go. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate your time. You're very generous, and I hope we
My
will do
pleasure.
this in the future.
Yes,
Enjoy
indeed.
yourself.
Wonderful. All right. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too, man. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.